Thank you for coming to hear me talk about my book, Reclaiming History, The Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's obviously my magnum opus, the book of my career. It's the book that Cindy, I think her name is Adams, she's a columnist for the New York Post. She said, you start reading this book, she said, in grammar school and you finish as a senior citizen. Well, it's not quite that long. And then she also said that this is not a coffee table book. It is the coffee table, she said. About a month ago, KOCE, I think it's a little cable TV station out of Orange County, they showed a taped interview of me, and they interspersed it with some courtroom footage of me in 1986. And looking at, 1986 is 21 years ago, and that is a long time ago. But looking at the way I look now, and back then in 86, I think I've aged more, at least appearance-wise, than 21 years. And I think the reason is that this book has taken a toll on me. And I told my wife's friend, I was telling her that this book probably took a physical toll on me. She said, no, you look fine, Vince. I said, yeah, I know, I don't look a day over 90. She said, you don't. And, but this book, as I say, I may have bitten off a little more than I can chew. I succeeded. I think I succeeded, but along the way, what may have happened, as with no other project in my career, like I said, I may have bitten off a little more than I can chew, and it had a physical, it's taken a physical toll on me. And I've always been somewhat immune to the deprivations of work. Work has never bothered me. I just routinely work 7 days a week. That's my normal, 7 days a week, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, many, many times, 70, 80, 90, 100 hours a week. I would try 1 or 2 month murder cases in front of a jury, didn't feel anything when it was all over with. There's some lawyers I know, they try a 1 or 2 day drunk driving case in front of a jury, and because of the stress or whatever, they'd have to go to Palm Springs to recuperate. But I have never felt, as I say, the deprivations of labor. But I had never met the Kennedy assassination before, and I may have bitten off a little more than I can chew. I first got involved in the Kennedy case way back in 1986 when London Weekend Television, a British production company, called me and they wanted me to, quote, prosecute Lee Harvey Oswald for the assassination of President Kennedy. And up to that time, I had been approached a couple times to appear on television in artificial courtroom settings, and I had always said that I wasn't interested. And I told them, I said, well, I'm honored you thought about me, but I'm not interested. They said, wait a while, this is going to be totally different from anything you've ever heard of before. And when they told me what they were contemplating and planning, my misgivings quickly dissolved. What they were doing, they were going to have a very unusual type situation, probably never done before. We were going to have a regular federal judge, they said, chosen from the federal district court in, where was it? President Bush's hometown. Not Crawford, but Midland, Texas. A regular federal jury chosen from the jury rolls of the Dallas Federal District Court. Jerry Spence, the cowboy lawyer from Wyoming. And when I say cowboy, by the way, I'm not speaking in denigration. Jerry's a great, great lawyer, but Jerry thinks he's a cowboy. I mean, he comes into court, with his Stetson hat and his cowboy boots. We were going to be in trial for, they told me 28 hours. It turned out to be 21, but that's not too common to have a 21-hour TV production. They only showed 5 hours over here, although they showed more in other countries of the world. But there were two things that in particular appealed to me. One, they were going to have the original Warren Commission witnesses. The original Warren Commission witnesses. The very people I would have needed if I were hypothetically to have prosecuted Oswald in real life. And the most important thing by far, there's going to be no script. Because I said if there's going to be a script, I'm not interested. They said, no, we've heard about your love affair with your yellow pad. And I still work with a yellow pad. I don't even have a computer. I'm still in the 19th century working with a yellow pad and pencil. And I think Jerry Spence will tell you the same thing that I'm telling you now. He and I worked just as hard on this murder case, even though it was, just a docu-trial, they called it, than we have on any other murder case in our respective careers. And a good part of our legal battle in London is in this book right here, either in the main text or in the CD. The jury ultimately came back with a verdict of guilty. It was during my preparation for this trial that I discovered two things about these conspiracy theorists. Number one, I discovered that they were guilty of the precise things that they accused the Warren Commission of, i.e., bias and distorting the official record. It was they who were guilty of these precise things. The second thing I learned is that these conspiracy theories, some of them at first blush may have been, plausible, but upon sober scrutiny they did complete violence to all conventional notions of logic and common sense. And yet I knew that most Americans believed in this nonsense, and it was at that point, way back in 1986, that I decided to do a book on the case, and I've been working on this book for over 20 years. Although in the intervening years I've done other things, but always this was my main book. In the last 7 years I've been working 70, 80, 90, 100 hours a week, 7 days a week. I've had 3 books that got up to #1 on the New York Times hardcover bestseller list in true crime. Helter Skelter, of course, on the Manson case. Outrage, The 5 Reasons Why O.J. Simpson Got Away with Murder, and The Sea Will Tell. And any of you who have heard me on radio or TV talking about those 3 books, I don't recall ever boasting about any of those books. I told the audience what was in those books, but I didn't boast about them. But I have to say that it's difficult for me to speak candidly about reclaiming history without boasting and being immodest or sounding immodest, which is not good. Although Churchill, we learned from Churchill that modesty is not always a virtue. He was running for re-election against Clement Attlee, and one of the British journalists said to him, "Sir Winston, I think you have to agree that Mr. Attlee's a lot more modest than you are," whereupon Churchill said, "Yes, but then again, Mr. Attlee's got much more to be modest about." So anyway, I was saying that I find it difficult to speak about this case without boasting, and yet the alternative is even worse. Because if I do not speak candidly, one could think that this is just another one of the close to 1,000 books on this case. But it's not. It's not just another Kennedy assassination book. And if you want to sell books, you don't put out a 1,600-page book. You don't do that. Maybe 400, 500, 600, 700 pages, but not 1,600. So I did not write this book to make money. Although I said I hope I did. And I did not write it for the bestseller list. I wrote it for the ages. And I'm happy to say that major review after major review around the country has said that this book is a book, in words to that effect, a book for the ages. In fact, the LA Times review used those precise words. They said, "With reclaiming history from this point forward, no reasonable person can argue that Lee Harvey Oswald was innocent. No sane person can take seriously assertions that Kennedy was killed by the CIA, Castro, the mob, Soviets. Reclaiming history may finally move these accusations beyond civilized debate. It is a book for the ages." Wall Street Journal said that it's unlike any other book ever written on the assassination. The Philadelphia Inquirer said 100 years from now, when historians want to know what happened in the Kennedy case, they'll read Reclaiming History. The great American crime novelist Scott Turow just gave a review a couple weeks ago, said that centuries from now, people would be reading Reclaiming History. So I think it is the book on the case, and I think that's the main reason why Tom Hanks and his people are going to be doing a 10-hour miniseries for HBO on the book. Very briefly, Reclaiming History is the first book on the assassination ever to cover the entire case. The assassination is such a broad area that no one even attempts, I like a fool did, but no one attempts to write about the entire assassination. They'll spend 5 years or 10 years just writing about the CIA or Garrison's prosecution of Clay Shaw in New Orleans. That's the whole book. And this is the first book that covers the entire case. Secondly, it has always been the conventional wisdom that there would never be a satisfactory resolution to this case. Even by those who believe that Oswald killed Kennedy and acted alone, even those people said there'll never be a satisfactory resolution to this case. There's always going to be some doubt, some mystery, but I have to say this book settles all questions about the Kennedy assassination once and for all. And it isn't just I saying this. This is people that have read the book say it answers all questions about the case. Reclaiming History is also the first book that has taken on all of these various conspiracy theories and demolished every single one of them. And my editor in New York said it took a book of this magnitude to finally put a stake in the heart of the conspiracy movement in this country. I should add that in Reclaiming History, my editor said, you know, Vince, I don't know if you know it, but you're also writing the history of an era here. And I wasn't thinking in those terms, but he said, yeah, you are. And I know what he means now because I incorporate into the narrative, as these events relate to the assassination, many historical events, like the Civil Rights Bill, or the Civil Rights Movement, Kennedy's Civil Rights Bills, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, Vietnam War, Gulf of Tonkin. All of these are discussed in depth in this book as they relate to the assassination. And during the Q&A period, if you want to know how these events relate to the assassination, I'll certainly answer that question for you. In fact, the book, I didn't even pay any attention to it. Looked up here, it says history. So it's not even in the true crime section of the bookstores. It's in the history section. And the History Book Club has made it a selection. Reclaiming History is 1.5 million words. If we assume the average book's about 400 pages, that's what my publisher said, and the average number of words per page is 300, this is equivalent of about 13 volumes of 400-page books. Now, it's not just the main text. I'm talking about a CD at the end with another 1,100 pages. There's over 10,000 citations. It may be the most heavily sourced nonfiction book ever. The Warren Report, people have said, was the most heavily sourced book ever written, but that only has about 6,500 citations. This has over 10,000 citations. So it's pretty heavy. Someone said after the book came out, well, Vince, you just had your baby, and I wasn't thinking of those terms, and it weighs about 7 pounds, or about 7.5 pounds. But those who are reading the book, no one is complaining about the length. Now, why is that? I think I have the answer for you. If you were to read, let's say, a 1,600-page book on some economic theory, at some point you'd say, hey, you know, I've read enough about this economic theory. But this book is broken down into sections, and each section is a separate story. When you're reading 4 Days in November, where I take the reader not just on an hour-to-hour basis, but a minute-to-minute, sometimes second-to-second chronology of what was happening on the day of the assassination, up to Monday, so it's Friday through Monday, 4 days. When you read that section, it has nothing to do with the Oswald biography, where I take the reader from Oswald's origins in New Orleans all the way up on his long journey to the Sniper's Nest window, with all the stops in between: Dallas, Fort Worth, New York City, Japan, Moscow, Minsk, Mexico City. When you're reading about the presidential autopsy, the autopsy of President Kennedy, that has nothing to do with the famous Zapruder film. If you're reading about whether the mob was involved in the assassination, that has nothing to do with whether the CIA was involved. So what I'm finding, some people are reading it from the first word to the end, but most people are telling me that they're jumping around. They pick up the book and they think the CIA was involved, so immediately they turn to the CIA section. So no one is complaining, as I say, about the length as far as those that are reading it, but it is keeping people away who have not read it. Why is the book so long? Well, number one, it's the first book to cover the entire case. Number two, there are two realities here. One reality is that this is a very simple case, very simple. Earl Warren is the head of the Warren Commission. He used to be the district attorney up in Oakland. And he said, and I agree with him as a former prosecutor, that if this had been a murder case in Oakland or LA and the victim was not the president, it would be a 2-3 day murder case. Very simple case. Oswald killed Kennedy and acted alone. And within a very short time of the shooting in Dealey Plaza, probably about 2 hours, local law enforcement down there. I'm talking about the Dallas PD, the Dallas Sheriff, local office of the FBI. It was very obvious to them that Oswald had killed Kennedy. And within about a day, when they learned what an absolute kook this guy was, that he had acted alone. And that's one reality which remains to this very day. This is a very simple case. But there's another reality here. And that's the main reason for the length of this book. Because of the unceasing and fanatical obsession of literally, and I'm not exaggerating here, thousands upon thousands of assassination researchers and conspiracy theorists who have examined every single conceivable aspect of this case for close to 44 years, splitting hairs and then splitting the split hairs, making hundreds upon hundreds of allegations. This simple case, which remains simple at its core, has been transformed into its present state. And what's its present state? I'll tell you what its present state is. The Kennedy case is now the most complex murder case by far in world history. Nothing even remotely comes close to the Kennedy assassination. Just to give an example, in manuscript form, one of the endnotes, I'm not talking about the main text here, I'm talking about the endnotes on a CD. One of the endnotes on acoustics ran to 120 pages with about 60 footnotes. That's what they've done to this case. Also, if we're talking about how unusual this whole case is, other people have said, long before me, that the Kennedy case is probably the most interesting story, fascinating story ever told. And this is why, to this very day, people talk about this case all over the world, to this very day. Books are still being written about it. You know, 9/11, I don't know how many books were written on it. 7, 8, 9, 10, something like that. Well, last year, about 6 books came out on this case, and there's about 3 that are going to come out in the next couple months. More words have been written about the Kennedy assassination than any other single one-day event in world history. You could get 10 of the best novelists anywhere and put them in a room and give them all the time they want to come up with a presidential assassination as unbelievable and as intriguing as this. They won't even get within 100 light years of it. It's just unbelievable. I mean, the cast of characters alone rivals anything in Shakespeare. And I mean that. With any project in life, we know, without even thinking, it's just intuitive. We just intuitively know that if we work long and hard enough, we're going to reach the bottom of the pile. We don't even have to think about it. And that's a reality. If you work long and hard enough, you reach the bottom of the pile. I can tell you, and this is not just a casual turn of phrase, there is no bottom to the pile in the Kennedy assassination. I'm not just playing with words now. It is absolutely endless. No bottom to the pile. It is a bottomless pit. As I'm talking to you right now, there's probably 100 people in this country that are looking at some document from the National Archives, looking at every period, every comma, looking for some inconsistency, some discrepancy, some contradiction, some tiny, tiny hint of a conspiracy. And when you have 100 people dedicating their lives to a case and 1,000 other people working part-time, they can create a lot of mischief. And they've done that. I'll tell you how successful they've been. I think I've already touched on it. Through their books, radio and TV talk shows, movies, that's Silly Oliver Stone, and college lectures and stuff like that. They've totally discredited the Warren Commission. They've succeeded in completely discrediting the Warren Commission and convinced the overwhelming majority of Americans, 75%, that Oswald was either a member of a high-level conspiracy or just some patsy who was framed by some exotic and elaborate group of conspirators ranging from anti-Castro Cuban exiles to organized crime working in league with with U.S. intelligence. So they've been very, very successful. I was talking to about 600 lawyers back east after Stone came out with his movie. A silly, silly movie, just one continuous lie. Well, look, I have to amend that. I got to be fair to Oliver. Got to be fair. He had the date right. November 22nd, 19. He got that right. I want to be fair. He had the victim, the president, right? He had that. He had the city, Dallas. Other than that, it was just one continuous lie, and yet he convinced millions of people that he was telling the truth. And he had the stratospheric arrogance to say he wanted his movie, get this, to replace the Warren Report. Unbelievable. Anyway, the movie had just come out a couple months earlier or so. And I was speaking to these lawyers, not about the Kennedy case, tactics and techniques, the trial of a criminal case. And during the Q&A period, I could tell by the rhetorical nature of the questions that, the Kennedy case came up, and I could tell by the nature of the questions that the questioner somehow believed there was a conspiracy in the case. So I asked for a show of hands. There's this vast forest of hands. Right? I don't know, 85, 90% of the people raised their hands. So I said to them, I said, now, you're all intelligent folks, although some people might question that when we're talking about 600 lawyers, but in any event, I said, you're all intelligent people. I said, what if I could prove to you in a minute or less that even though you're intelligent, you're not thinking very intelligently about this case? As I say, my first question, see, when I had them raise their hand, what was the purpose of raising their hand? Did I tell you? What did I say? Why did I have them raise their hand?
Did they believe it was a conspiracy?
Okay, that they believe there's a conspiracy. Okay, right. So anyway, I said, I'm going to prove in a minute or less that you're not thinking very intelligently. Well, there was kind of a murmur out there. And then finally someone from my right friend said, we don't think you can do it. I said, all right, start looking at your watch. I said, I'd like to have another show of hands for how many of you people saw the recent Oliver Stone movie or at any time in the past read a pro-conspiracy book or any magazine article propounding the conspiracy theory or otherwise rejecting the findings of the Warren Commission. Again, it seemed like the same number of hands, 80, 90% of the audience. I said, I don't have to ask for a show of hands on my next point, and the clock's ticking. I said, I think you all agree that before you form an intelligent opinion upon a matter in dispute, you have to hear both sides of the story. You've got to become knowledgeable about both sides. I said, like the old West Virginia mountaineer said, no matter how thin I make my pancakes, they always have two sides. So I said, I don't have to ask for a show of hands on that. I said, with that in mind, I said, how many of you have read the Warren Report? And it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing. A couple people raised their hands. I had proved my point, someone said, about 47 seconds. These people out there had formed the opinion that there was a conspiracy, and they rejected the findings of the Warren Commission, and they hadn't even bothered to read the Warren Commission report. And mind you, I wasn't asking them how many of you read the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission, just the 888-page report. A couple people raised their hands. Okay, if I could condense the billions upon billions of words in this case on the issues of whether Oswald killed Kennedy and whether he acted alone into just a few minutes. Let me see if I can do that for you. Time magazine about a month ago gave me a page to summarize why I felt there was no conspiracy in this case. Let's talk about Oswald's guilt first. And I'm just trying to condense everything. I learned as a prosecutor, and you don't have to be a prosecutor, it's just common sense, that if you're innocent of a crime, chances are there's not going to be any evidence pointing towards your guilt. Why? Because you're innocent. But now and then, because of the nature of life, the unaccountability of certain things, there may be one piece of evidence pointing towards your guilt, even though you're innocent. And in some, unusual, rare situations, maybe even 2 or 3 pieces of evidence pointing irresistibly to your guilt, even though you're innocent. But in this case here, everything points towards Oswald's guilt. I have a section here where I set forth 53 separate pieces of evidence that point unerringly to Lee Harvey Oswald's guilt. And under those circumstances, it would not be humanly possible for Oswald to be innocent. At least not in the world in which we live. I'm talking to you folks, you can hear me, there'll be a dawn tomorrow, that world. Only in a fantasy world can you have 53 pieces of evidence pointing towards your guilt and still be innocent. Can't be done. Impossible. What are some of those pieces of evidence? I'll just give you a couple. The murder weapon was Oswald's. I mean, that's pretty heavy, right? The 6.5 millimeter Carcano rifle, that was Oswald's. He owned and possessed the murder weapon. Number 2, after the shooting in Dealey Plaza, Everyone stays there, you know. He's the only employee who flees the book depository building. 45 minutes later, he shoots and kills Officer J.D. Tippett, Dallas Police Department. And I told the jury in London that that murder bore the signature of a man in desperate flight from some awful deed. 30 minutes later, he resists arrest, pulls a gun on the arresting officer. During his interrogation, he told one provable lie after another, all of which showed a consciousness of guilt. So there's no question that Oswald's guilty. His guilt is shown not just beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond all doubt. On the issue of conspiracy, there's no credible, let's italicize the word credible, there's no credible evidence that the CIA, mob, or any of these other groups were behind the assassination. All we have is naked speculation. I told the jury in London, I said, you know, folks, 3 people can keep a secret. I said, oh, I'll stipulate to that, but only if 2 are dead. And here we have a situation close to 44 years later, and not one single word, not one syllable has leaked out about any conspiracy. Why? There's nothing to leak out. Number 2, there's no evidence that Oswald ever had any connection with any of these groups believed to be behind the assassination. And God knows the FBI checked this guy out every breath he ever breathed. From the time he arrived back in the United States from the Soviet Union on June 13th, 1962, up until the date of the assassination, they conducted 25,000 interviews. They found no evidence that he ever was connected or associated in any way with these groups believed to be behind the assassination. Number 3, if one of these groups did decide, and I'm just trying to summarize it for you as I did for Time magazine, if one of these groups decided to kill the president, which I reject out of hand, by the way, it's just moonshine, just silly. I'll give you an example. CIA. You know who was the head of the CIA at the time of the assassination? Does anyone know?
Allen Dulles?
No, it wasn't Allen. John McCone. Who's John McCone? He's a family friend of JFK. JFK appointed him the director of the CIA, and he's going to turn around and murder him? I mean, it's crazy. But I have to say this, even though I'm rejecting it out of hand, not in my book. My book, I go into considerable depth on all of these charges. But I'm just saying it's silly on its face. But if they were going to kill the president, Oswald would have been one of the last people on the face of this earth whom they would have gone to. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. Number 1, he was not an expert shot. He was a good shot, but not an expert shot. Number 2, he had a $12 mail order rifle. 3, he was notoriously unreliable, extremely unstable. I mean, here's a guy that defects to the Soviet Union pre-Gorbachev. I mean, even today, who in the world defects to the Soviet Union? I'm not trying to be funny. Who defects to the Soviet Union? And then he gets over there. He wants to become a Soviet citizen. They turn him down. What does he do? He tries to commit suicide. He slashes his wrists. Just the type of guy, now I'm being sarcastic, just the type of guy that the CIA or mob would want to rely upon to commit the biggest murder in American history. Let's take it a step further. They want to kill the president, and for whatever crazy, bizarre reason, they want Oswald to be the killer. Okay, let's see if where that takes us makes any sense. After Oswald shot Kennedy in Dealey Plaza and left the book depository building, one of 2 things would have happened. Let me tell you the least likely thing first. This is the least likely thing. There would have been a car waiting for him to help him escape down to Mexico, Costa Rica, wherever. Certainly the conspirators wouldn't want their hitman to be apprehended and interrogated by the authorities, right? That's the least likely scenario. The most likely scenario, and I think you folks already know what I'm going to say before I say it. You already know what I'm going to say, right? The most likely scenario, if the CIA or mob got Oswald to kill Kennedy, the most powerful man on earth, for them, there would have been a car waiting for him to drive him to his death. You know that would have happened. You absolutely know that would have happened. And yet we know that Oswald's out on the street with $13 in his pocket trying to flag down buses and cabs, okay? Now that fact alone tells any sensible person that there was no conspiracy in this case. In fact, the presidential motorcade, that route, wasn't even determined until November 18th, 1963. 4 days before the assassination. Does anyone really believe the CIA or mobs are going to conspire with Oswald to kill Kennedy within just 4 days of the president visiting Dulles? It's crazy. It's nonsense. Okay, before we get into questions and answers, I'm sure I've got some conspiracy buffs out in the audience. Maybe they want to cross-examine me. Do we have any buffs out there? When I say buffs, you know, buffs are the ones that it's their whole life. I mean, they go to conventions. No, they're allergic to the truth. Absolutely. They go to conventions down in Dallas. They subscribe to newsletters. It's a big, big part of their life. But the majority of Americans that believe they're not buffs, they simply believe that there's a conspiracy. But there may be some buffs in the audience, which is fine. See if I care. I shouldn't say that. I say that now and then. People laugh when I say it. Okay, before we get into questions and answers, I want to discuss two of the main issues that have been used very successfully by conspiracy theorists to convince Americans that there was a conspiracy in the assassination and or that it wasn't Oswald who fired the shots that killed President Kennedy. These two issues are the head snap to the rear and the so-called magic bullet. On the head snap to the rear, the Zapruder film was shown for the first time to the American public in 1975. It was a pirated copy. It was a national audience. Geraldo had some shows, Good Night America, or something. It was on ABC. It was network. So we're talking about maybe 20, 30 million people watching it. So they're showing the limousine coming down Elm Street in a southwesterly direction, and all of a sudden, of course, you see the president's head exploding, struck in the head. And immediately after, you see the head snap to the rear, 8 inches to the rear. And understandably, lay Americans said, well, you know, wait a while. Now, if the head went to the rear, that means the shot must have come from the front, where the grassy knoll is, to the right front, not to the right rear, where Oswald was in the book depository building. And in London, Jerry Spence showed that section of the Zapruder film 5 times. I didn't object. And he said it looked like Babe Ruth that hit the president in the head with a bat. He said, Mr. Bugliosi is trying to convince you folks that what you saw with your very own eyes never happened. And if I never had an answer to that in London, I think the verdict would have been not guilty, because that would have raised a reasonable doubt as to Oswald's guilt. Now here's the answer. The answer is that if you look at the individual frames of the Zapruder film, Abraham Zapruder, amateur photographer, 8mm camera, he filmed the whole assassination. If you look at the individual frames, you can't see it if you look at the film. You have to look at the individual frames. And in fact, this is the only book that has the 2 key frames in it. The Warren Commission volumes have it, but no other book on the assassination that I've ever seen has it. If you look at frame 312, which is in the book, the president's head's okay. At frame 313, which is 1/18 of a second later, there's 18.3 frames per second in the Zapruder film, you see the explosion to the president's head. And in what direction is the president's head pushed at frame 313? Slightly forward, indicating what? A shot from the rear. So at the all-important moment of impact, that's more important than any other time, the all-important moment of impact, you see the president's head being pushed slightly forward, indicating a shot from the rear. It was 2.3 inches forward. And then at frames 314 to 321, you see the head snap to the rear, which the pathologists say was a neuromuscular reaction. Nerve damage to the president's brain caused by the bullet causes back muscles to tighten, which in turn causes head to snap to the rear. The second issue that they've... the head snap to the rear, legitimately, people could think that the shot must have come from the front. The magic bullet is just a pure creation of the conspiracy theorists. These people lie not only when there's a document, an official document refuting what they're saying, but get this, even if there's a photograph or a film controverting what they're saying, they still lie. Now why? Well, I imagine they figure, well, how many people have access to that film or to that photograph? But nothing will stop them. Here's what they've done with the magic bullet. In their sketches, and I have a sketch in the book, in their books, they put Governor Connally seated directly in front of President Kennedy in the presidential limousine, directly in front. And they say a shot coming where Oswald, they say, supposedly was shooting, passing through Kennedy's body, a straight line, soft tissue. Once it exited the president's throat, they said to hit Connally, it would have to make a right turn in midair and then make a left turn to go on to hit Connally. Because if Connally is seated right here and here's Connally and here's Kennedy, a bullet coming like this would have to make a right turn in midair, make a left turn. So-called magic bullet. Of course, if you start out with an erroneous premise, everything that follows makes a heck of a lot of sense. The only problem is that it's wrong. Connally was not seated directly in front of the president. He was seated to the president's left front in a jump seat a half a foot in. So a bullet passing on a straight line through Kennedy's body had nowhere else to go but to hit Governor Connally. Now in London, Spence called Dr. Cyril Wecht, the coroner of Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, to the stand, and he said, Dr. Wecht, tell this Dallas jury, the jury was from Dallas, but the trial was in London, tell this Dallas jury, or explain to the jury, how would you describe this bullet? He said, well, Mr. Spence, it was a magic bullet. Bullets don't even do things like that in cartoons. So on cross-examination, I said, now, Dr. Wecht, I said, this bullet, on a downward trajectory, a straight line, passing through soft tissue. This is not the headshot now. This is the shot that entered the president's upper right back, actually the front of his throat. So passing on a straight line through soft tissue, which you agree, if it did not go on to hit Connally, as you claim it did not, I said, how come it didn't tear up the interior of the limousine or hit the driver or anyone else? He says, I don't know. He said, Mr. Bugliosi, I didn't conduct the investigation in this case. I said, no. Now, wait a while, Dr. Wecht. I said, now it appears like you got your own magic bullet. I said, it's descending, downward trajectory, straight line, exits the president's throat. I said, if it did not hit Governor Connally and did not tear up the interior of the limousine, did not hit anyone, I said, it must have zigzagged to the left. He says, no, it need not have zigzagged to the left. I said, did it hop, skip, and jump over the car? He says, no, it need not have performed any remarkable feat like that. I said, well, then tell this jury, Dr. Wecht, what happened to that bullet? He said, I don't know. So if we believe these conspiracy theorists, if we believe what they tell us, apparently when this bullet exited the president's throat, it vanished into thin air without a trace. Right? Now that is a magic bullet. And yet the conspiracy theorists have hung that magic bullet around the neck of the Warren Commission for close to 44 years, and we find out that it was they, not the Warren Commission, was the magic bullet. After over 40 years of the most prodigiously intensive investigation and examination of a murder case in world history, nothing even comes close to this. Certain powerful facts exist which cannot be challenged. Number one, not one weapon other than Oswald's Carcano weapon has ever been found and linked to the assassination. Not one bullet other than the 3 fired from Oswald's Carcano rifle has ever been found and linked to the assassination. No person other than Oswald has ever been connected by evidence to the assassination. No evidence has ever surfaced linking Oswald to any of these groups believed to have been behind the assassination. And no evidence has ever been found showing that any person or group murdered the president and then framed Oswald for the murder that they committed. Now, one would think that faced with these stubborn and immutable realities, the conspiracy theorists, unable to pay the piper, would fold their tent and go home, but no, undaunted, unfazed, they continue to disgorge what they've been doing for over the last 40 years, just wild speculation, theorizing, and a shameless dissembling of the facts of this case.